To hear more of this and other great interviews, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and help support the show. We thank you in advance.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today, we love to have authors on because they write books. And, if you listen to the show, we do narrative episodes, and I write those. And they take years. In the case of episode 3 that we're working on now, years to do. And it's mostly because I'm lazy. And also because I'm busy. And so I have a lot of respect for authors who write books because I know how hard it is to be able to focus, because I have adult ADHD or whatever the hell it's called. I've diagnosed myself, by the way. I don't really know for sure. But anyway, the point is I admire them because of the amount of work that it takes to do these things. And then not only to write it all and put it all together and get it published, but also to get almost everything right in the books. That's also pretty good because I'm not particularly good at that part. Anyway, the book that we're doing today is Ends of War by Caroline E. Janney. But we're going to call her Carrie from now on. And we're going to first get into why is her name spelled differently than it's pronounced. So first of all, Carrie, welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you on.
It's good to be here.
You and I were talking beforehand. It's Janney.
It's a long A. Yes, it's Janney.
But most people would say Janney.
Yes.
Because of the double N.
Double N, short vowel N. Lots of Virginians have the name Janney.
Mm-hmm.
The president of the Virginia Secession Convention was John Janney. My family, though, says it differently. And my theory on that is my grandfather was from Giles County down in Southwest Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I think that long A, that twangy A, stuck. Janney. Yeah.
So he was saying in his mind, Janney.
I don't know what he was saying in his mind.
But he's like, hey, Janney. We're the Janneys. Yeah, I get it.
That's us.
And you are, what did I write down here? The now professor of Civil War history at UVA.
Correct.
UVA is a beautiful school.
It is.
I had a friend who went there. I went to high school with him, and then he went down there, and we went to visit him, and man, it was nice. So we're from New Jersey, and he, would report back to us freshman year, fall semester, and he'd be like, they have this thing down here called Krispy Kreme. And you can go, because we didn't have them in Jersey at that point. So you can go in there and you see the donuts being made, and then it comes out all warm and delicious and everything. And now they're all over the place, but that was the first Krispy Kreme.
They didn't have them in New Jersey?
Not at that point, no.
Wow.
We're talking, like 5 or 10 years ago, or 20,
sure. Yeah.
25 years ago, whatever.
Are there even any in Pennsylvania?
Are there? Mike Lenz says yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No, Mike, are you sure?
I don't think so.
Duncan territory right now.
Yeah. We're Duncan territory. Well, see, Jersey's been Duncan territory for a long time, but now there's some Krispy Kremes there.
Well, now we have an even better donut shop, one that came from North Carolina, from the Outer Banks, called Duck Donuts.
Duck
and
Donuts.
And they, too, make those right in front of you, and those warm,
They're up here. Well,
Can't beat it.
There's 2 of them up by Harrisburg.
Duck Donuts?
Yeah. There's one in
heard of
Camp Hill, and then one over by the Union Deposit exit off of 83.
Well,
They are phenomenal.
They are.
Well, it's unfortunately I've cut them out of my diet, so you wouldn't know it by looking at me, but I've cut donuts out of my diet in an effort to not be so fat. Ends of War. The subtitle being The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox. What gave you the idea to write this?
Well, it came from, I was going to work on an edited volume that came out on the Appomattox campaign. And I had long been interested in what happened to Lee's men after they left Appomattox.
Sure.
So I thought this was going to be a demobilization story, a story about how the men got home. And it is. But as I got into the research, I realized there were so many more questions I had that couldn't possibly be answered in a single essay.
Okay.
And I started digging around and finding all of these unintended consequences. I found thousands and thousands of men who hadn't been paroled at Appomattox but had been paroled at other sites in Virginia and Maryland and West Virginia.
But they belong to the Army of Northern Virginia.
They belong to the Army of Northern Virginia. And I kept asking myself, why hasn't anybody written about this? Why is this untapped? Why is this part of the story that we don't know about? And part of it, I think, is the way in which the story was told by veterans after the Civil War. But I realized that there were all of these complexities, these nuances, these unintended consequences, as I said already, that neither Grant nor anyone else could have portended.
Right.
And that led me down this road to what became a book.
And it is interesting because I got it, I don't know, in the mail a month or two ago, I think. And I started reading the first chapter. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting stuff. Never even considered this idea at all. You know, I just figured, like a lot of people probably, Lee surrenders to Grant. And then word gets around a couple days later, Johnston surrenders and the war's over and everybody loves each other again. And they're putting up monuments to the enemies of the United States. That's what I thought. That
happens a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm fast forwarding.
Okay.
But that's not quite it. And why would it be clean when a civil war especially is always a mess? And it was no more messy or no less messy than the war itself in many ways.
But you bring up a really interesting point, and
that's why I have this job.
You know, you're great at it. I'm really impressed.
Yeah. Don't lay it on too thick.
Okay. Well, I'll reel it back just a bit.
Yeah, please.
But your point about fast forwarding, I think we've done that. We tell the story of the surrender at Appomattox, and then we jump to Lincoln's assassination, and then we're in Reconstruction.
Right.
We don't even cover Johnston's surrender.
No, it's like he wasn't even there.
Right. And when it was a bigger surrender in many ways.
And that's what's so interesting. We'll get to that later, but yeah, go ahead.
But this notion of slowing down the pace, taking it day by day, week by week, pretending that we don't know what comes next in order to understand how people at the time were living through these days that they certainly hoped were the end of the war, but weren't quite certain. That's the feeling that I wanted to get to. That's the sentiment that I wanted to try to bring out of understanding. And I think maybe I've been working on this project for many years, but the pandemic I think has also crystallized in my mind. You know, we were told it would be 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. Oh, maybe it'll be until the fall of 2020. And this kind of constant pushing things off and never knowing when something is going to end. The uncertainty going back to what is a new normal after you've been through something. So again, I was already thinking about these questions, but it's brought it into stark relief to think about people wanting a war desperately to end.
But also not.
But also being very wary of what that's going to look like.
But also some were like, keep going.
Oh, right. So the Confederates who refused to concede.
And I was surprised to see how many of the writings of the women back in Richmond, they were like, you know, they would rather die. And, you know, just amazing how to the bitter end some of these people are holding on.
And that's the one part that didn't surprise me. Because of my first book in particular that looked at women's organizations, that women who take their ladies' aid societies and immediately transform those into memorial associations to grieve Confederate dead. I'd read enough of their letters to know they're holding out hope to the last minute that France is going to sail into the Chesapeake Bay, that this is going to be the revolution all over again. And they're talking about Mexico and what's going on down there. They're talking about Napoleon coming to the rescue, Napoleon III. But I was really surprised to see the number of young men. And I think that's key there. Yeah. There's a generation that came of age not knowing anything but the sectional conflict.
Right.
These are more elite men for the most part. They come from slaveholding families. They come from families that have the most to lose in many ways. These are the diehards. These are the ones who refuse to concede. These are the ones that are hightailing it either to the mountains, the Shenandoah Valley in the mountains, or to North Carolina. They're the real holdouts.
And all right, so let's get to then Lee's surrender. what are the terms that Grant extends to him and they agree to and everything like that?
So the first term is a term that is absolutely standard in any surrender, and that is that the enemy, the Confederates, will lay down their arms and their flags, surrender themselves. And Grant will treat the surrendered Confederates at Appomattox the same way he did at Vicksburg, meaning that he is going to parole all of them, that he cannot send them all to prisoner of war camps. That's simply not feasible at this point. And so they will be paroled prisoners of war to be sent home. But Grant will add a provision at Appomattox that hadn't appeared in earlier surrenders, and that is that these men will be left alone by the United States government so long as they don't break any laws. This is, we take this for granted. We often rattle off the terms that Grant offered, but to stop and think about how very radical in some ways this provision was and what it does in a legal sense. Grant's not a lawyer, and he's not thinking about it in a legal sense, but he knows via the laws of war, he knows that having treated the Confederates as an enemy belligerent, that you can't then try them for treason in the post-war period. And so this is putting on what some people will argue is a blanket pardon.
So wait, say that again. So because you've treated them as an enemy belligerent, you can't try them for treason.
Right.
Why?
So this is a legal quandary throughout the course of the war. It goes to the Supreme Court, something called the prize cases, which end up with the Confederacy in a dual legal status, meaning that on one hand, we're treating them as rebellious citizens who have committed treason. On the other hand, we're treating them as any other enemy that we might encounter in warfare, any other nation. So France.
But we're not recognizing them as a nation, the Confederacy.
This is the fine line that the Lincoln administration is walking. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, which is a problem.
Yes.
And by telling them, by Grant's terms, saying that if you go home, we won't bother you. We're not going to arrest you. Essentially, what many people read into that, and what Grant meant by that, and what many Confederates believe from the beginning, is that he is saying that we won't be tried for treason. And part of Grant's thinking here is we've treated them as prisoners of war. You don't take prisoners of war among civilians. You arrest civilians and you try them for whatever crime they've committed.
But you can't exchange prisoners with. You can't even exchange prisoners with, a state in rebellion. You can only really exchange prisoners with a foreign belligerent, which is why, like during the entire course of the Revolution, there was never a prisoner exchange between us and the British, because if they had done that, they would have legally recognized as a
we're foreigners.
Nation.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is where the legal ambiguity, and this legal ambiguity has been there since the beginning of the war, and it's something that Lincoln and his administration, his War Department has been trying to figure out all along. And instead of clearing that up, Appomattox actually makes it even messier and even more difficult to figure out, because again, Lee and others are saying immediately, well, this must mean, in so many words, I'm putting words into their mouth, but the implication is that this is essentially a blanket pardon, that the parole, by paroling them and sending them home with this caveat that you will not be molested by U.S. authorities so long as you obey the laws in place, then that seems to be a promise that you're not going to be tried for war crimes, that you're not going to be tried for treason. And this is going to be a huge hullabaloo in the summer of 1865, because President Johnson and others are going to look around and say, well, it's one thing for the vast majority of enlisted men. They've been duped by the leaders in the South. They were, we can't hold them all responsible, but we can hold people like Lee responsible. And so when in early June, we have Lee and 36 other Confederates, some of whom are officers in the Army of Northern Virginia, some of whom are members of the Confederate government. They're indicted for treason in the summer of 1865. And the argument, Grant's going to have to get involved in this. The argument is that, well, at least those that are paroled, we can't touch them.
Right.
Because their parole already protects them. And so that's going to be the great legal question in the summer of 1865 to be figured out.
Fascinating. Mosby. There was something with Mosby.
There's a lot with Mosby.
Yeah, but regarding the amnesty or pardon, or just the whole, like, everybody's cool if you just go home and don't break any laws, except that Mosby. Where does that come from?
That Mosby.
Yeah. Well, what happens with that?
So there's a couple of different strands with Mosby. One is the accept Mosby policy is put in place when Grant will say that every member of the Army of Northern Virginia, even those that are detached, which will include the 43rd Virginia Battalion, Mosby's Rangers, that they should be included in the surrender terms that were offered at Appomattox. Okay. They should be paroled, whether that's in Winchester, Virginia, or at Harper's Ferry, or the Northern Neck,
wherever they're found. If they're members of the Army of Northern Virginia,
they can come in and get paroled. At the beginning, there's a caveat that says except Mosby.
Right. But that's not from Grant, though.
That's not. Well, that comes from Stanton and Halleck.
Yeah, okay.
Stanton and Halleck. But Grant at first is kind of wishy-washy, and then he says, actually, I think you should extend this to Mosby. And part of that is that Grant and others are fearful of a guerrilla war. And I want to point out here that even though guerrilla warfare on the scale, it doesn't happen on a large scale, but that fear, the potential for guerrilla warfare is very much driving Grant. It's driving Sherman. Sherman's writing to his wife the very day of the surrender at Appomattox, telling her that he's worried about this type of partisan warfare that will continue. That it's not enough just to get the surrender of the major armies, that we have to worry about these other forces. So Grant does say, extend this to Mosby. Try this with Mosby. So Winfield Scott Hancock is up in Winchester, and he's charged with trying to convince Mosby to surrender. And this will go back and forth. Hancock never actually meets with him. He said, he's a colonel. I'm not meeting. I'm a major general. I'm not going to meet with a colonel. But this goes back and forth. It sounds like Mosby might surrender. And then finally, on April 21st, he decides to disband his Rangers rather than to surrender
them. So he doesn't actually surrender. They just go home.
But here's the kicker. Mosby and about 6 of his men ride south. They're heading to Richmond. He says he's going to talk to Lee and try to find out what he can do to continue the fight. By the next evening, at least 380 of his Rangers have surrendered themselves, have sought paroles at Winchester. So they've ridden kind of northwest to Winchester from Salem, and including his second in command, William Chapman. And a bounty is immediately offered, $2,000 for Mosby's head. Mosby will go hide out for a bit. He'll go back to, he had grown up in the Charlottesville area, had an uncle in Nelson County, which is adjacent to Charlottesville. He goes there and hides out in the mountains, and he's sending word to Lee, has an uncle that's writing letters to Lee, trying to find out whether by late May, early June, he too can be paroled. And he will be paroled. He'll be paroled in early June. And then he rides into Charlottesville, and the provost marshal in Charlottesville says, this can't be real. There's no way that Mosby has been paroled, of all people to be paroled.
Right.
And in fact, he writes to various people and finds out that, in fact, Mosby has been paroled. But this isn't enough for Mosby. Mosby's going to show his face in Alexandria, Virginia. And this is going to cause quite a stir, because this is the area that he has been terrorizing for nearly 2 years.
Right.
And Union officials there are beside themselves. Plus, even though Alexandria has a significant loyal Union population, there are enough Confederates there that are celebrating the fact that the gray ghost is showing his face, that their union officials are really worried about the celebrity that Mosby has.
Right.
So they want to get rid of him as well.
So for the benefit of people listening who might be new enough to all this that they don't really know exactly why Mosby was such a exception, why was he such an exception? What did he do?
So he was a partisan ranger.
Which was what?
So, well, this is the question. He's been authorized by Lee, by the Confederate Congress, to wage a different style of warfare than if we think regular in the ranks, regular armies, the Army of Northern Virginia, so on and so forth. And even though he's attached, his unit is a battalion, it's detached from Lee's main army, but he is doing strike warfare. He'd been a scout the first 2 years of the war. He had ridden with Stuart, had been an adjutant to Stuart. And he believes that the best way to get at the federal army is to strike at its resources, to strike at its supplies. And so he is spending most of the war in and around Northern Virginia, so Fairfax County, Loudoun County, attacking Union supplies and essentially harassing any Union post in the area. And he's quite successful at it. He is able to come off with horses and cattle and all sorts of provisions. And he seems to be everywhere at once because the real difference is that his men aren't marching in the ranks. He doesn't have a cavalry that is riding into town with sabers making noise. They disperse into the countryside. And they are sometimes wearing Confederate uniforms. It seems clear that they're not always wearing Confederate uniforms. They're not exactly bushwhackers. And there is a distinction between partisans were authorized by the Confederate government, guerrillas were not. But as far as the federal army is concerned, there's no distinction between a partisan and a guerrilla.
Right.
And they equate Mosby's tactics with the same sort of guerrilla tactics, bushwhacking that's happening in Missouri and other places.
It's just the Eastern version of it.
The Eastern version.
Yeah.
And he is sanctioned by Lee. Lee commends his actions, and it's clear that he is successful in helping to thwart some of the Union advance during the 1864 Valley Campaign. He's able to distract Sheridan's troops enough to prevent some things from happening there. Mm-hmm. So he's been a thorn in the side of Union officials, and there have been enough instances of retaliation, of grabbing Union soldiers. There's kind of a back and forth. Several of his men are hanged in Front Royal, and then he will retaliate and kill several Union soldiers.
Aside from just being annoying, there's some atrocities that he has committed.
And this notion of him being everywhere at once, that he could have one small group of 40 men that show up in Warrenton, and another small group that show up in Millwood. He's everywhere at once, and that's why he gets the moniker of a gray ghost, of a specter of sorts. And this notion that men could blend back into the countryside, that they could be taken in by the home front. This is in particular, it's very disturbing.
Sure, it's
to
scary.
Union officials. It's incredibly scary.
Yeah.
How do you fight an enemy you can't find?
I don't know. You don't.
You don't.
You get Vietnam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So that's the big deal about Mosby. That's why he's the exception to the.
He's the exception to the rule, and yet he's not.
And yet he's not. Yes, very confusing. But the whole war is, so I guess it just fits. Okay, civilians. How are they reacting to the news of Lee's surrender? Seems a little bit mixed, or what? How would you describe it?
So are we talking about Confederate civilians?
Yes. In Virginia.
So there's a lot of disbelief. We've talked already about women in particular who refuse to believe that the Army could possibly, that Lee could possibly be willing to capitulate. So,
but there, I mean, the war is going on in Virginia, right? How are they so naive?
I don't think it's being naive. I think it's this deep-seated hope, this deep-seated faith.
So they're delusional. Well,
from our perspective, they might be, but I I think they've seen Lee come out of scrape after scrape. And even Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Gettysburg is certainly no victory for Lee, but he still manages to rebuild an army and still manages to fight on. And so there's this hope. And I think another thing to keep in mind, even though the Appomattox campaign only takes up the first chapter of the book, it's important in setting up the fact that it is a campaign, that we might call it a retreat now, might call it Lee's retreat. That's not what Lee was doing. Lee wasn't.
No, he had a reason for.
He was trying to get west, to get to the railroad connection, to get down to Joe Johnston.
Mike, you got something? Keep raising your hand over there. There you go.
The question I have: did the surrender at Appomattox signal the end of hostilities during the war?
Great question.
That is a great question because it's a really hard question. So, does it signal? I'm going to use your verb there to build off of. It does signal to people that the most important Confederate army has capitulated. That the symbol of the Confederacy, by this point, Lee, more so than Jefferson Davis, more so than any other figure, is the Confederacy, and his army is the Confederacy. So absolutely, if you look at the letters and diary entries of Union soldiers in the ranks of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, they're writing in camp on the night of April 9th and April 10th that the war is over. They can't wait to go home. And they're still waiting there as Lee's men are being paroled. The cavalry is paroled first, and then the artillery. They see them going home, and they are quite anxious to go home themselves. They believe that the war is over. You read newspaper accounts as far west as San Francisco, and people believe that the war is over. They want to believe the war is over. The vast majority of Confederate soldiers are not surrendered yet. So Johnston's army, Kirby Smith's army, they're not. But Appomattox, there's no major battle. There's no major bloodletting after Appomattox. So we know now that it was the end. But for people at the time, that's really unclear, especially in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination. It's really unclear what's going to happen next.
So, so good question there, Mikey. All right, so back to the civilians, though. Sorry to jump around like that. The women. There's a couple of quotes I'm looking for in the book here, but maybe you would remember them off the top of your head. Oh, wait a second. Hold on a sec. I think I found it here. Mary Washington. It was a Cabell. Cabell. Everybody pronounces that word differently.
Well, that's the Virginia way.
Some people up here call it Cabell, Cabell.
We have a Cabell Hall at UVA.
She's the daughter of a local minister down Virginia somewhere there. She says, "If my death could have averted the blow, I must now record it would have been willingly given." So she's willing to have died in order to have avoided the surrender. So she says. I
think she's in Lynchburg.
Lynchburg?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay.
So I think there's a bit of hyperbole there,
I'm sure,
to say the least.
I'm sure. People were very poetic back then when they wrote.
And actually, a lot of women will use this language. There's another young girl, I think she's 16, 17 years old in Charlottesville, named Sally Strickler, and she says the same sort of thing. That, oh, if only I could have died and not witnessed the death. She makes some remark about people like Stonewall Jackson being the lucky ones because they don't have to witness the death of the Confederacy. So, but that's easy to say if you're not on the front lines.
Exactly.
That's easy to say if you haven't been marching for the past 4 years or 3 years.
Well, yeah, when other people are out there fighting the war for you, you want to keep it going because you're sitting at home in relative comfort and,
Relative comfort.
Yeah.
I mean, and so there's a lot of gender dynamics there at play.
Yeah, I know.
And the women they've been told all along during the course of the war that they are incredibly important, that they are essential to Confederate morale. And they believe this. I think it is true, but they take that very seriously. And so they want to continue the fight. And there's a different experience. What does the end of the war mean for someone who hasn't been in the ranks?
Yeah.
Who doesn't have that war weariness and exhaustion in the same. It's simply not the same for a civilian versus a soldier in the ranks.
So prior to the surrender, what are civilians in the South being told? Are they being given an honest assessment of how things are going in the field?
Well, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear how dire the straits are, especially if we're talking the winter of 1865. And everything from food shortages. Keep in mind that the quartermaster's department is coming around and taking whatever provisions might still be available in the countryside.
Right.
You know, cattle, hogs, whatever might be left has been taken. And so there certainly is a sense of impending doom. It's clear that some of these men have started going home. Desertion is starting to rise in Lee's army in the winter of 1865. And people in the home front know. They see what's going on. They are probably well aware of the peace commissioners that have met over the winter, having these conversations in Hampton Roads and elsewhere. So this doesn't come out of the blue.
It's not going well, yeah.
And they know that this is the case. But when the end comes, you can see that among those who supported the Confederacy, there's still an idea, a notion that they need to continue to support their soldiers. And so to the extent possible, opening up homes for shelter as these men are making their way home, allowing them to sleep in your barn or on your, even
kitchen
on your
floor in front of the fire,
on the stoop, wherever the case may be,
right.
Providing them what little food you might have left. And soldiers are recording this in their diaries and letters. They're recording the names of people who assist them on their way home. They're also, at least in one instance, there's a map that Confederates are drawing and sharing with each other. Like, we heard that there's provisions at such and such's house, and here's how you get there. So that word of mouth, spreading the word. They're also keeping account of the Unionist who won't feed them, who won't shelter them, and they record their names as well. And so there's a sense of who is going to continue to be supportive and who's not. In places like Lincolnton, North Carolina, where a number of artillery men are headed, thinking that that's where they're supposed to meet up and continue to fight the war, the town throws open its doors. They are feeding soldiers to the extent possible. There's a hotel that opens up for Confederate soldiers. But the really surprising thing was that there are a couple of instances, it happens in Greensboro, happens in Charlotte, where soldiers will ransack the quartermasters, the commissaries, and take what provisions they see belong to them.
Yeah. Wasn't there one in Salisbury, too?
Salisbury? I don't write about that.
Warehouse? I thought, yeah. What? Danville, thank you.
So Danville, Greensboro, and Charlotte are the three places that we see these kind of big instances. Not that it couldn't happen in Salisbury.
I just remember seeing Salisbury. I read this last night before I went to bed. So
did it put you to sleep?
No, it didn't actually. It kept me up until 2 a.m, but I was getting tired. Not because of the book.
Okay.
The melatonin.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Well, so the point here being is that Confederate civilians, as they're writing about this in the newspaper and otherwise, will talk about the fact that these soldiers are ransacking warehouses. That's not appropriate behavior.
Right.
But we understand. And we understand that they're starving and they have fought for us. So maybe we should forgive them this transgression, even though it's not something they should have done. And so where they draw the line is they say it's one thing to ransack government stores. It's another to attack private businesses.
Right.
And so they're making a distinction. These government stores belong to the soldiers, even though their behavior might have been bad.
Right.
So they're forgiving them, and they're helping to account for why they behave in the way that they do.
Are there any instances that you can recall of Confederate units turning on each other?
So there is the one instance is it Charlotte? I believe it's Charlotte or Greensboro? It's probably Greensboro, where some of Johnston's men are having to go in and fire upon Army of Northern Virginia soldiers who are looting.
So there's Army of Northern Virginia soldiers who had gone down to join Johnston's army.
Well, not necessarily. These men are likely paroled. They're just going home. But they're looking for food and clothing along the way.
They are looting, and Johnston sends North Carolina troops, I believe, right?
Yes.
To go and stop them. These North Carolina troops were of late from the Army of Northern Virginia.
Right.
And so now they're firing on their own former comrades.
That's right.
And what happens with all that?
So, I mean, it becomes even messier because then some of the North Carolina soldiers, the ones from Johnston's army, they start looting as well.
Yeah.
And eventually an officer comes in and fires a pistol and things are settled down. But there's a real moment of panic of what kind of melee is going to ensue.
It kind of like, have you ever seen that movie Downfall about the last days of Hitler in the bunker and everything like that? You've seen, it's a great movie. It's all subtitles, but it's fantastic. Have you seen it, Mike?
Oh, I have seen it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So this is kind of the way I picture the end of the Civil War was like the end of Downfall, where people are just like hanging people in the streets and just going crazy and having these crazy parties while shells are exploding everywhere. And because it's you've fought for this cause for 4 years. And probably for a good chunk of that, no matter how hard it got, maybe somewhere in your head it was like, we're eventually going to win this.
Absolutely.
And now you've lost. And so, you've got people who are like, let's get the hell out of here. Mm-hmm. I'm coming to get you. We're going to Texas, and then we'll go beyond that if we have to. Like, they're ready to leave the country they fought for because the thought of being back with the Yankees is just so reprehensible to them.
And what's kind of surprising is how few people actually do leave. I mean, there are those.
Like a whole population of people in Argentina or something like that? Not Argentina.
Go to Brazil.
Brazil, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's like a small little village. Mike, go ahead. Mike, you could sit over here. Get the microphone and just open your... So raise your hand when you're sure.
Listening to this, I think I need a little bit more clarification on is, okay, so we have paroled soldiers from Appomattox going home,
right?
Presumably. But did all of Lee's army surrender at Appomattox?
No.
Okay.
No.
And do you still have those men who may have straggled or may have fallen out during the road to Appomattox? Are they still in the countryside? Are they still doing something?
This is a good question. We should get into this.
Okay. So here's your very, very rough math. So bear with me, okay? 60,000 men are available to Lee on April 1st. Mm-hmm. So this is including those at Petersburg and Richmond. You have the highest number, and the numbers vary, about 28,000 who surrender at Appomattox between April 9th and April 12th. Accounting for the casualties along the way, so the various battles between April 2nd and April 8th, so through Appomattox Station, it's about 11,500 casualties. This is my very generous math here. There's still about 20,000 men unaccounted for.
Aha.
So what happens to those men? So to your question, some of them are going straight home. There's a guy named Benjamin Sims, for example, and he gets separated from his unit on April 2nd. And he knows he's separated from his regiment. He gets separated across the river, and he decides he's just going to go home. He was a conscript from Louisa County. He said, my war's over. He keeps an account. He writes this in his diary. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to go home. So as of April 2nd, he heads home to Louisa County, so to the northwest from where he was at that point. Forget the actual date, but by the end of the month, he has gone in and sought a parole. So I think the vast majority of these men go home. But there are those who are making their way down to Johnston's army to continue to fight. Those tend to be artillerists. They tend to be cavalrymen. These are men who have horses.
Right, they can get there.
And they are of a certain elite status. Mm-hmm. They have
more to lose.
They have more to lose. Yeah, these are 20 to 30-year-old men, for the most part. Almost to an end. They're 20 to 30 years old. They're men who came of age during. They haven't known anything but sectional strife.
Right.
These are the men that Pete Carmichael writes about in his first book, in the Last Generation book. And they come from slaveholding families. They come from elite families in Virginia and South Carolina and elsewhere. And they have usually they're a lieutenant colonel, they're a colonel. They have a lot to lose, and these are the ones that are determined to keep fighting. There are others, and there are others that I talk about who also are making their way to Joe Johnston's army. But the vast majority of those 20,000, I have this project where I went through the parole records at National Archives, and I have a database of about 16,000 men who were paroled at places other than Appomattox between April 9th and July of 1865. And if you look on the maps, you can see that most of them are paroled relatively close to where their homes are.
Okay.
Which suggests to me
they were home or on their way.
There are exceptions. So Mosby's men that I talk about, a lot of those men weren't from Winchester, but they go as a group to Winchester to get paroled. But I can see there's still another question bubbling.
No, I'm just trying to get in my mind of what the situation is in the days after Appomattox. So to think about, you've got Virginia and Southern Virginia and North Carolina. You've got this milieu of paroled soldiers going home.
Right.
You have these soldiers who dropped out on the road to Appomattox also going home. You also have the men who are looking to continue the fight, trying to link up with Johnston's army. And so that's the situation in which you find those quartermaster depots are getting ransacked because it's a combination of those different groups that are doing it.
Well, and then there's also stories of units leaving, slipping away, and then getting to a certain point and deciding to disband. And then the commanding officer, I think Rosser was one of these guys, if I'm not mistaken. The commanding officer, Rosser in this case, is going to find out what's going on, and then we'll all get back together again.
Right.
And there's not. It seemed to be that there wasn't. Nobody was really sure. Did Lee really surrender? Did he surrender just a few thousand men? What is going on? And so some guys are on their way down to meet with Johnston, and I forget who these were, but they bump into someone.
These are artillerists from Richmond.
Yes.
From Richmond Howitzers.
Is it McIntosh?
Well, he's not part of the group I think you're talking about right now, but McIntosh is another one that takes off.
But anyway, so they bump into someone else. Was it Breckinridge?
So
who did they bump into that said,
No. So if you're thinking about the Richmond Howitzers, so they're heading toward what's present day Roanoke, and they bump into Hotchkiss, Jedediah Hotchkiss, Stonewall Jackson's map maker, and he tells them that in fact the surrender has happened. So that's the other thing to keep in mind: the way in which information and rumor is traveling.
Right.
But
the person I'm thinking of, they were told, keep going. So it wasn't somebody. It wasn't the. I'm thinking of a different story. Do you know who I'm talking about, Mike?
You're talking about maybe William Pendleton.
Pendleton.
That's right.
Mike, let's.
Good job.
Good job. 6 questions. It was Pendleton.
So
yeah.
There's all of this varying information. And there's also, I was struck by Pittsylvania County. So Pittsylvania County, right on the border. If you're present day, you're taking 29 south in Virginia, heading into North Carolina. Pennsylvania had basically been untouched by the armies anyway. Quartermaster's department had been there. Commissary agents had been there, but hadn't been touched by the war. So there's more stuff there, more food there. And a lot of these men are traveling through Pennsylvania on their way to Danville, on their way to Greensboro. And there are these great letters from a woman on the home front who has sons in Lee's army, and she's hoping for information. So as these soldiers are coming through, she's asking them, do you know anything about my sons?
Yeah.
Do you know what their status is? So think about that. You're on the home front waiting for your loved one to come home. and you're reliant on the information that's being brought by these men, the unknowing. It's all part of that.
It's just a very uncertain time.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think we have just too neatly narrated what April of 1865 looks like, and we've lost that displacement and that uncertainty. And I mean, even what we haven't talked about are African Americans, both on the home front and in the Army.
I had a question about that too. But go ahead. What was the status of them with the surrender? Did that free everybody?
That's the question. No.
It doesn't. No? What?
No. Guess what? No.
What?
That's a default answer, right?
So, I mean, on one hand, it's not surprising that Grant's terms said nothing about slavery. He's not allowed to deal with political questions, although the question had come up at Vicksburg. But the war's not coming to a close at Vicksburg in the same way. But there were certainly enslaved men and free men who had been coerced into laboring for the Army in Northern Virginia. There are hundreds still at Appomattox, and they have to make decisions about how they get home. How do they get home to their loved ones? Are they going to travel by themselves? Are they going to travel with their masters, former masters, whatever that murky status is at that moment? But there are also plenty of enslaved people along the way that are obviously still enslaved when we read the accounts of these soldiers who talk about, coming to a farm or plantation, and the enslaved laborers are still the ones who are serving them. They're still the ones who are cooking for them.
Or taking them across the river.
Across the river. And the ways in which they're forced to do so. There's the example of one man who is hiding his slaves because he sees the writing on the wall, and so he's going to go find them and hide them. And so it's really unclear what the status of enslaved people is going to be.
Yeah.
Does Lee's capitulation equal emancipation? Not necessarily.
No. They're going to have to deal with that later, but they got to clean up the military messes first.
The 13th Amendment has been passed, but not ratified yet.
Right. And it's going to take a while before you can actually enact it.
And then you got to enforce it.
That's what I meant, enforced, yeah.
Which is a whole nother issue.
Yeah. Again, it's a mess.
It is a mess.
It's a messy time.
That should have been the title. It was a mess.
Well, the second edition.
There you go.
Second edition, you just retitle it. It was a mess. Okay, so now the guys that do get down to Johnston's army, I'm imagining they're thinking that Johnston's going to be like, "Oh, so glad you guys are here. Come on in."
Yeah.
But what happens to the guys that surrendered and went down there?
Right. Johnston, those that he speaks to directly, he will ask them whether they were in Lee's lines, and when they say yes, he said, "You're part of the surrender. You can't do this." And so there is something to be said for that military tradition, for that upholding of these values. And he's certainly not going to have anyone who's been paroled be part of his army. But he is clear about who can and cannot join his fight. And if you've been part of Lee's army, he says, you've been surrendered, therefore I cannot accept you into my ranks.
Let's go backwards a little bit with Johnston here before we actually get into that part. What is his army's situation? Who are they facing? Are they doing well down there? Are they doing better than Lee was doing in the Appomattox campaign, or what?
Not so much.
Oh, okay.
I mean, they're doing better in that they haven't surrendered yet.
Right.
Maybe that's
they're still holding out.
So they're facing off against Sherman and his command.
Uh-huh. And they're in what, North Carolina, right?
They're in North Carolina, but they're spread out. So unlike Lee's army, which is basically in and around Appomattox Courthouse, and the Union Army has managed to surround Lee's army.
Right.
Lee's army really, other than the handful of cavalrymen, they can't escape. That's not the case for Johnston's army. Johnston's army is spread out on a long arc from Durham Station, kind of. I'm going to forget the number of miles off the top of my head, but it's a significant area that they are spread out across. And so Johnston doesn't have to capitulate in the same way. And this is why you have the negotiations with Sherman. Sherman way oversteps his boundaries. He is going to offer political concessions. Remember, the one thing that I think sometimes we forget, it's so obvious, but we forget about the American Civil War, there was no peace treaty. There were surrenders of armies. But what Sherman initially offered is perilously close to a peace treaty.
Right. He went a little bit further than Grant did.
He goes a heck of a lot further. Than Grant
he kind of takes the role of a politician too, right?
He does.
But it's not like if they get together. Was it April 17th?
April 17th is the first meeting.
Is the first meeting. Kind of just talk things out a bit, and then say, okay, let's meet again tomorrow. And then
it's
Johnston's
not until April 26th that we have the final.
Right. Okay. So they meet again, and then they hash it out some more.
Yes, but then when those terms are sent to Washington, then this is when Stanton loses his mind.
This time,
to put it nicely, and there's a meeting that's called a cabinet meeting that's called. So Andrew Johnson is there, Grant is called in, and they read these terms, and Stanton is beside himself. He thinks that Johnston has essentially committed treason, that it's not just that he's overstepped his boundary. Sherman.
Sherman has,
yes.
Don't worry, I just had to correct you because unless somebody hear this and go, she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Yeah.
Why would he be mad at Johnston?
Sherman overstepped his boundaries.
Okay. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Mike Lentz, yes. Go ahead. If you have questions.
So what are the limitations on military commanders?
Great question.
Are they in charge only of the capitulation, or do they have the authority to negotiate political issues?
So the former. They can only negotiate the surrender of armies. That's kind of vague, though, right? But Lincoln has told Grant, when they met aboard the River Queen, he's told Sherman this. Sherman was at that meeting.
He was there, yeah.
That the only thing that they can do is deal with the military situation in front of them. In fact, when there was a correspondence in February of 1965 where Lee is wondering about what are the terms of peace, and he doesn't say surrender, he says of peace, and Grant's not invited to be part of that conversation because Grant is the military. He's not a political figure. He is not an office holder. And so Grant is very clear, and Stanton and others will constantly remind Grant that his duty is only to negotiate the surrender. Sherman is working on a couple of factors. One of those being that he knows that Lincoln has talked about calling back into session in Virginia, the Virginia legislature. And that doesn't play out in part because of the assassination, but it might not have anyway. But Sherman is using that as his logic, or so he says, for why he is willing to talk about state governments and restoring state governments. But the moment that he talked about state governments, he's beyond the pale.
Purview, yeah.
Right. And so Stanton will publish this tirade in the newspapers in the North, and he's again calling out Sherman for committing treason. There's the great description
in the newspapers.
So when the Grand Review happens, May 22nd, May 23rd, 1865.
Yeah.
Sherman will have nothing to do with Stanton. He refuses to acknowledge him because he has essentially slandered him. But Grant gets sent down to North Carolina, gets sent to Raleigh to rein in Sherman. And Stanton tells Grant, you go make sure that this surrender is the same as what you offered to Lee.
Right.
To Grant's credit, he doesn't want to humiliate Sherman and undermine him. So he goes and talks to him, but he doesn't go and meet with Joe Johnston. He allows Sherman to go back. And that's when we get the final terms on the 26th, which are still a bit more than Appomattox.
Right.
They do go a little bit beyond, so we can see some of the lessons learned at
Since
Appomattox. Since
yeah.
Appomattox. But we also... Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm formulating the question.
Well, the other thing that's happened in between is that once Stanton is beyond questioning Sherman's terms, then he starts thinking about Grant's terms and whether Grant had the authority to issue the terms that he did. Specifically, that clause about men not being disturbed by U.S. authorities. And so he will ask the Attorney General, James Speed, to offer a legal opinion on Grant's terms. And so Speed will come out with that opinion on April 22nd, which will say a host of things, such as Confederates can't appear in public in their uniform. That's a violation of their parole. That wasn't part of the term that was given on April 9th.
Right.
This is also where we get the Confederates from border states cannot return to Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and
so they
Delaware.
have to stay in a southern state.
They're supposed to. At least that's where we are on April 22nd. So the point of all of this is that what we think was set in stone on April 9th is quickly being questioned. It's being changed. It's being altered.
Right.
And people are trying to maneuver and trying to adjust to all of these unforeseen consequences of disbanding Confederate armies.
Isn't that so typical, though? Like the military men, you know, if anybody should know about wanting peace, it would be the military men, because they've been having war for 4 years and they want to end it. They know how horrible it is. So they come up with something that I think sounds, you know, putting myself in that mindset, having never been in it, but what I imagine it to be. Let's just end this. Let's go back and let's make peace and let's try to, you know, move past this. Then the goddamn politicians come along and then they get their things and then they get their fingers in it and then no wearing uniforms. You got, you know, it's just, and then it ruins it. But my question there that I was going to ask before is Stanton, when he's getting all bent out of shape over this stuff and saying this stuff in the paper about Sherman and everything. Is he not at all concerned that it might ruin the potential peace that is being worked on?
Well, that's what Grant is warning him about.
Aha.
But we have to keep the bigger context in mind, too.
Okay.
Booth is still on the loose at this moment. If there's one Booth, why can't there be more? Mm-hmm. And that goes back to that fear of partisan warfare that Grant and Sherman had been worried about. It's not crystal clear that all of these Confederates are in fact going to capitulate. And the provost marshal at Appomattox is a whole nother story that we probably don't have time to get into, but there's a trial of a congressman from Maryland, Benjamin Harris, who is accused of encouraging two allegedly paroled Confederates to continue the fight. And now I've just lost my train of thought. Oh, goodness. Isn't that lovely?
Say what you just said again.
I don't know what I just said. That's what happened. Benjamin Harris. He's accused. And so all of that's happening on the same day as Booth is killed. It's the same day that that Johnston's terms, that Sherman's terms to Johnston are finally accepted. But all of this is still very much up in the air. And we forget, we fast forward. This is back to where we started. We go too quickly over and we don't appreciate the day-to-day uncertainty. Because we want it to be just wrapped up in a bow.
Want it to be neat. Yes.
And we think of ourselves as, one of the things that we do is pat ourselves on the back and say, who else could end a civil war so peacefully?
Right.
And Union soldiers are doing this too. They want this to be wrapped up, neat and done in their memoirs, in the regimental histories that will be published within a year, within 2 years of the war. They're ending this story April 9th, April 10th, maybe with the grand review.
Right.
But
yeah, that's the happy ending.
That's the happy ending.
Yeah.
It's not all of this
roll credits,
hedging and trying to figure out what's going to come next.
Yeah.
And that's the That's the palpable uncertainty of that moment.
And it's very terrifying. And you mentioned the pandemic. And I mean, I guess that and for me, and people my age, 9/11 are two events where things were uncertain for a while. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of people are still uncertain with the pandemic, although I think most people are kind of like mentally over it, but there's still like the powers that be, they're still playing the game, and we're all like, and some people are just like, what are you talking about? Like, life is fine. Leave us alone. And I think that's like a mental, what do you call it? A defense mechanism.
It's what we want to believe, what we need to believe.
Right. And it's kind of like those women writing about, France is going to, like just, you're hoping against hope.
Right. Because you need to.
You have to.
You do what you need to do to survive.
Yeah. Because what's the point of
what you need to tell yourself?
What's the point of trying to make it to tomorrow if tomorrow is just going to lead you closer to that horrible ending that you've feared for so long?
Right.
So you got to you got to keep hope alive, as they say.
Yes.
So Jeff Davis, though, what was his? So he hears Lee surrendered. He goes, "Oh, well, that's probably all over now. Let's
let's
wrap it up, boys."
Yeah.
Right?
Instead, he gets on his train and keeps heading south.
Yeah. Well, he's going on vacation.
He's going on vacation. Yeah, he was heading down to
Florida,
to Georgia.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
He's going to Cabo.
He's going to Cabo. No, what's it? So he's kind of delusional, isn't he? Or he's just not hearing it.
He's refusing to agree, and he is one who is encouraging this partisan guerrilla style warfare and wants it to turn into that. And even though Breckinridge and others are saying no. This can't happen, and it takes him a bit. Again, he is on his train. The Confederate capital is essentially a moving capital at this point, first to Danville, ultimately to Charlotte, and then into Georgia. And some of these men are trying to find him. When they realize that Johnston won't take them, they said, well, we'll just go find Davis.
It's
and
like
maybe
when mom says no, you go and ask dad. And dad's like, yeah, okay. And
part of it seems somewhat trivial now, but there are a handful of them that they want their commissions. And
I was going to get to that, yes.
They know that their commission paperwork has been lost in the Appomattox campaign, and so they're seeking that out, but which also suggests that they don't think this is over. Why in the world doesn't it make you more of a target to have that colonel's commission at that point?
Well, they can't let go of it for some reason.
But this is their identity. This is absolutely how they think of themselves.
Listen, David McIntosh and Ham Chamberlain.
Ham Chamberlain.
What a great name. Said did not consider themselves guerrillas. In fact, they remained concerned that their status as officers in the Confederate Army still held. On April 16th, Chamberlain asked Colonel Archer Anderson to introduce him to Breckinridge. In the retreat from Petersburg, Chamberlain's baggage had burned, and with it, his captain's commission. He now sought assurance that his status as an officer would not be in dispute. Several days later, McIntosh penned a letter to Jeff Davis explaining that, you didn't say Jeff Davis, I did, explaining that he had escaped on the morning of April 9th prior to any official announcement that a surrender would be made, and, quote, his reason for writing was to ensure that his standing as an officer would not be affected. So, yeah, it
still matters.
It still matters.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess, even if you can't get the commission or like all the perks of commanding at that level, at least, when you're sitting on your porch as an old man, people can call you captain now instead of lieutenant.
Yes.
And you at least get to end the war as a captain.
But again, it's easy to say that from this perspective, but doesn't it make you more of a target for Union officials, depending on what they decide to do?
Sure.
Not that they're thinking that way either.
No, they're not. Right, yeah.
They're thinking about the Trans-Mississippi West, and they're talking about that a lot. Let's get across the Mississippi. Things will be different there.
Yeah, we can continue the war out west, and we'll call it the Wild West.
And when things get really bad, we'll head to Mexico, and we'll meet up with Maximilian, and we'll fight this war from there.
It really is amazing the things that people think when they're in desperate times and.
No, I think there is something about the human nature of that, right? That we grasp and hold on to what we need to.
It's almost like they're at their most human in this time period because of that uncertainty, and that's where you run on instinct.
Right.
Like all the socialization and everything that we've had is just out the window.
I mean, the ones who are telling their mothers and sisters and sweethearts, I'll never see you again because I'm heading west.
Yeah. Screw you guys. I'm going home.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that one guy?
Home. I'm not going home.
Well, to a new home.
Yeah.
That's a quote from the great American philosopher Eric Cartman. So forgive me. What was that one guy who wrote his brother and sister about basically like everything, how to take care of everything? That was Chamberlain.
That's Chamberlain. Yeah.
It's amazing. And then the other guy, I forget who this was, but he was from Pittsylvania County, and he was writing his wife. And he's basically saying, I'm going to go see what's going on with the other armies. And he's like, but we're getting out of here once this is all, like,
right.
I'm going to find a new home for you.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is this was about chapters 3 and 8, ladies and gentlemen, that we were talking about here. And there are more chapters. It's not just a 2-chapter book, and she numbered them 3 and 8 for no reason. But these are basically the thesis of your book. These 2 chapters is really what it's covering, right? The main idea of the book is found in these chapters. And then there's other chapters, a lot more to it. I'm not just saying all you need to read is 3 and 8.
Skip the other chapters.
Yeah, skip the rest of them. Stick with 3 and 8, and you'll be fine.
That's what the second edition's going to be.
Yeah, second edition is going to only be 3 and 8,
and it's going to be titled "A Dumpster Fire of a Country."
We have so many other titles.
This will be good.
Next time you write a book, consult us for the titles.
I will.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because what was it? A Real Mess. It's a Real Mess was one, and then A Dumpster Fire of a Country. I really like.
There we go. That's
that
what
one,
my book's going to be titled.
Not if she does one first and takes it from us.
Well,
which you're welcome to have it if you write a book before Eric. Believe me.
I like both those suggestions.
Yeah. See, I think the history field needs to get a little bit of a sense of humor, and then people who normally say that history is boring would be like, "Oh, this isn't that boring." If I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this book. All I'm saying is if this said Dumpster Fire of a Country,
and
or it was a real mess, and a different image.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah. Then maybe Colbert would read it or something.
Yeah, maybe you could get on a bigger show than this. I'm so sorry. Have you been on anything bigger than, like, this isn't the biggest thing you've done, is it?
Oh, absolutely.
No, it
isn't.
Yeah. Don't say that. No. Okay, be honest. What have you done?
So
like C-SPAN?
I've been C-SPAN. Yeah, I've been on C-SPAN. But the History Channel.
Okay.
I was in the Grant special.
You were? Oh, yeah. That's right. I knew your face from somewhere besides the back of the book.
I haven't watched that since it came out.
Yes, that's right. Okay. Now it all comes together.
Yeah. The only one I remember is Avery because we
were friends with
Avery,
him. Yeah. Well, we know him.
But now you know me.
But now we know you. So now I'm going to go watch that again and be like, now I know 2 people. 2 and 3. I remember you. I remember now that you say it, and I know that's why your name sounded so familiar to me. Well, it didn't sound familiar because I read it as Janney. So it looks
now
familiar.
Now you know.
And let me tell you something. I think the reason why
words am hard.
You forgot what you were saying before was because you went out of your deep voice and you weren't paying attention to yourself.
I think that's it.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yes.
So, I got a pack of cigarettes over here if you need help, keeping it deep.
The deep voice.
Yeah, absolutely.
No. Don't ruin her
Square you up.
Cigarettes. That's terrible. Carrie, it was great to have you on. It was really fun.
So much fun. Thank you, guys.
I really had fun with you. You're a nice guest to have. So come back again.
Despite what Pete Carmichael says.
Oh, God, you should have heard the things he said about you. I mean, I have never heard of
If they weren't true, we could sue them for slander and libel, but they're all true.
But they're all true. Yeah. But in spite of that, we like you anyway. No, he said nothing but glowing things about you. Now you have other books that you've written.
I do have a few.
So
others.
then that means we have more reasons to have you on the show.
Yay!
Yay!
How often do you get up here?
Are we done?
Oh, well, I haven't closed the show yet. But this is
sorry.
No, this is the banter of the
banter. So, in most non-pandemic years, I'm probably up to 3 times a year.
Okay. So are we? So do you consider this a non-pandemic year?
Half-pandemic year.
Half pandemic.
So this is my second time up this year. I was up in September.
All right. Well, then we'll have you come up or have you come on the next time you're up.
Sounds good.
It will be fun. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Ends of War. Do I have it in the shot there? There we go. Okay.
I have a still.
Ends of War. There's a still there for you also. You can find a link to it on our website, addressinggettysburg.com/books. I recommend you get it. It's very good. Mike Lentz gives it a... How would you describe this?
Thumb and a pen up.
Yes.
No. This motion. What was this motion? Like a shaking thumb. No, not shaking, but a thrusting thumbs up.
There we go.
That sounds horrible.
What are you doing here? What is this motion? Punching. A punching thumbs up.
He's from Colorado.
Yeah. All right. He loved it, and you will too. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye. I'll never talk to you again.
Are we done here?
Now we're done. Okay.
Sorry,
now
it was such a change in tone.